Okay, we are in the last chapter of Hilchos Deos. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll finish tonight. Um, we are Halacha Dalid. We began yesterday talking about Lashon Hara, Rechilus, Motzi Shemra, all of the variations of slander. That is the common denominator over here, is what we call Lashon Hara, or slander, as they say in English. So now we're going to talk about in Halacha Dalid, a lighter version, which is what we call Avak Lashon Hara. The word Avak comes from the word dust or powder. The word in Hebrew for powder is Avka. So Avak Lashon Hara, the Rambam says, Yesh Dvarim she'en Avak Lashon Hara. Right? Not major, but minor. It's like alluding to Lashon Hara. Ketzad, mi yomar leploni sheyeh kamos shehuata. If I tell someone sitting next to me, I say, who's going to tell Levi, right? Ruvain's talking to Shimon. And he says, Shimon, who's going to tell Levi to keep on acting like he does? Or Oshe Yomar Shitku, mi ploni, any wrote to Lahadia ma ero ma haya. Or if I say, or if Ruvain says to Shimon next to him and says, I don't think it's a good idea to talk about Levi. I don't want to tell you what happened. It's like you're leading someone on, like, oh, did you hear what happened? And he's like, no, I don't want to tell you, right? I mean, you're like playing games. You're leading someone on, right? By not telling them the full story, hoping that they beg you to tell them, right? Well, this happens to us every day, right? Basically. So these are allusions to Lashon Hara that more often than not actually end up happening. So while it's not full-fledged Lashon Hara, it's talk between people that will most likely result in Lashon Hara. That's why it's called Avak Lashon Hara. Ukiyotze bedvarim ha'elu. So those are some of the examples the Rambam says that it's not full Lashon Hara, but when I, tell someone, hey, I can't don't even ask me what happened today to Levi, right? You're just like begging them, right? You're just begging them to pry the information out of you. So that's called Avak Lashon Hara. V'chol masaper betuvas chaveru mipnei sonav harei za Avak Lashon Hara. So there's something else the Rambam says, which is called the opposite. I'm actually speaking about someone positive. So you're going to say, shouldn't that be good? Right? So the Rambam says not so fast, because if I tell something positive in front of someone, now the Rambam says here, b'pnei sonav. The commentators are a little agitated by that, because the Rambam is making it sound like the only problem is if Ruvain talks to Shimon, okay, about something that Levi did positively. So the question is, what's the relationship between Ruvain and Shimon? So the Gemara says, even if Shimon doesn't have a dog in the race, so to speak, doesn't think anything of Levi, but the Rambam seems to say that it's a problem if Shimon doesn't like Levi. So really, and we could all understand this, we could all relate to this, that if you don't like someone and someone tells you something positive about that person, right? So I guess psychologically speaking, your defense mechanism picks up and says, yeah, he's good about that, but I got to tell you, he's a real loser in this area, right? So they're very quick to debunk your optimism and say, nah, he's really a nothing. Don't think he's so good. I got 9 bad things to tell you about him for every one thing you tell me good, right? And that's called speaking positive about someone. And the commentator, I mean, there's a really lot to talk about this, because the Gemara There's a famous Gemara that says that you're allowed to talk positive about someone if they're not there, right? It's called miksa shvacho befanav, kulo shvacha shelo befanav, right? Like if you want to compliment someone, you have to, never compliment someone fully to their face, right? The Gemara says in Eruvin, you have to always do a half compliment. But even if you do a half compliment or any kind of compliment, so how does that Gemara jive with this? Okay, we'll leave that alone, but that's something to look at if you're interested. It's an Eruvin. Anyways, I think like Nun Gimel or so. So we are Shlomo. This is the pasuk in Proverbs that says Mevarech Re'ehu b'kol gadol babokar hashkem klala techashav. Very interesting pasuk. It says that you attempt to give your friend a bracha in a loud voice, but it turns out you wake up in the morning and you didn't realize that blessing turned into a curse. The Rambam says, Shemitoch tuvaso bali de ra'aso. It starts good, but like a lot of things, end up negative. And by the way, that was, I think, what happened with Miriam, right? They're talking about how great Moshe was, right? And what happened? It ended up to saying, yeah, he's great, but he's so great that his wife wasn't holy enough for him, and he had to leave her. And that was the incident with Miriam at the end of Bahaloscha. So you got to be careful. So the other alternative problems with lashon hara is if you do it jokingly, right? You're very facetious about it. Oh, derech kalos rosh, or you do it lightheadedness. Klomar she'ena medaber b'sina. You don't appear to be really ranking on someone. You're doing it jokingly or sarcastically. I guess that's the correct word. That's also bad. Sarcasm isn't always a good thing, right? Hu sheshlomo amar b'chachmaso. That's what Shlomo says in Proverbs. Kimisla hayora zikim chitzim v'maves, right? Which is someone like a crazy person who throws arrows and fire and death, right? V'amar halo misachak, and he says, "I'm just kidding," right? So that's not good, right? You can't appear to be serious and then say, "Oh no, I was only being sarcastic," right? So that's a problem. Sarcasm also itself, the Gemara doesn't say positive things about, but I don't want to talk about that now. If you speak lashon hara through ramaut, slyly, right? Or you really want to say lashon hara, but you dress it up and say, I'm just going to tell you a story, what I saw. I was in the store yesterday. I saw a guy waiting online. This is what he did, right? Something negative happened, but you want to make it appear like you're just what the Gemara says, misaper lefitumo, just as someone who says, I'm just reporting, right? I'm just telling a story, what I saw. I have nothing, to add. And this is what I witnessed. That's called misaper lefitumo. Says the Rambam, ki ilu enu yodeh shedavar zeh shediber lashon harahu. I'm pretending that I don't know that this is really a negative story. I'm just going to make it sound like this is what happened, right? Without my spin. Right? So if he either tells it like in a sly way, right, just pretending to tell a story. So when the Rambam says that when this person, the one who tells the lashon hara, is reprimanded. So he says, "Eini yodea shedavar ze lashon hara." I didn't know that this was a bad story. O she'elu ma'asav shel ploni, right? Or that this person was involved, right? He's just telling over, what he thinks happened. So we know that you're going to get busted. So you got to be careful about even the slightest hint of lashon hara. That's what I think the moral of the story is. Okay, cinco. Number 5. It doesn't matter whether Ruvain speaks negatively about Shimon in front of his face, or behind his back. It doesn't matter, right? V'hamasaper dvarim shegormin im nishmu ish mipi ish lahazik chaver begufo b'mamono. If you talk about people that when it gets passed one to another to injure someone, either physically or it creates a monetary damage, even if the point is to cause harm or just to annoy him or just to frighten him, right? That is considered lashon hara. So it doesn't matter what kind of ill effects it has on the person that said lashon hara about. It could either be literal, it could be physical, it could be monetary. Whatever ends up happening, that's considered lashon hara. So the Rambam now tells the famous halacha that we should all remember from Cheskas Habatim, Bava Basra Daf Lamed Tes, I believe, that talks about the rule of lashon hara, which is, and it's a little difficult to understand, but basically, if I tell over something in front of three people, okay, and one of those three people then spreads the word, that part B of that statement is not considered lashon hara. So I probably shouldn't have told three people, but once I did already, that's what's called public knowledge, right? How do we define today, like when a person puts out a tweet and it goes to 78,000 followers, that's pretty much public knowledge. So 1,000 years ago, before Twitter and before everything, what is considered, right? Or like the people busted on the Jumbotron, right, at the Coldplay concert. What is considered public knowledge? So the Gemara makes a statement, and that's why it's in Bava Basra, because it's a discussion about doing macha, right? You remember when it comes to property, in order to have a chazaka for 3 years, the owner has to protest and say, "You get off my field, you get off my field," right? And then so the Gemara wants to know how many people does he have to protest in front of. So the Gemara says, well, if you hold that it's three people, once three people know that the owner of the house is protesting anyone living in his house, and that's considered everybody knows, and the person should get out. That's considered a macha, right? Because once three people know, that's as good as being published in the paper. Okay? So therefore, what's the ramification? If one of those three people the next day tells over something, that's not lashon hara anymore. It's a little bit, difficult to understand, but that's what really it is, because it's no different than if it was in the papers already. If it's in the papers, then no one's over lashon hara, right? It's public knowledge already. The whole point of public knowledge, the whole point of lashon hara is one person starts a rumor or anything, and it spreads like wildfire, right? Like what happens today, right? So that's if it's one or two people, but three people, that's already considered public. And if one of those three people, the Rambam says, "V'im sipur hadavar echad min hashlosha pam acheres ein bo mishum lashon hara." Okay, v'hu shelo yiskaven lahavir hakol galos yoter. The Rambam gives a really big qualifier at the end, and he says that's only assuming, right, that the intention of that one person of the three was not done to spread and further publicize it negatively. Again, how do you know? Okay, you could ask a kasha on that. It's a little difficult to understand, but the bottom line is three people is considered an oilam. Okay. Kol elu hem bale lashon hara she'asur ladur b'shchinotam. All these people that we mentioned that speak lashon hara, right, that we spoke about for the last 4 or 5 halachos, it is asur to live in their neighborhoods. And certainly, you cannot hang out with them or do business with them or just be their friends. They are not good people. And the Rambam ends off by saying the very last sentence regarding the halachas lashon hara, and he quotes this. He takes this right from. Remember, yesterday we said where all the laws of lashon hara are in Shas. It's in Erechin, right? Daf Tes Zayin or so. So he quotes this Gemara from Erechin. It says, "V'lo." I think this is actually a Mishnah in Erechin. "V'lo nechtam gzar din al avosenu ba'midbar ela al lashon hara bilvad." He says, if you want to know what the straw that broke the camel's back, literally, in the desert was the Meraglim, right? After the Meraglim, they were going to suffer and not go into Eretz Yisrael 40 years. And what was that all about? It was on Lashon Hara. Okay, so that is that. The last two, maybe we'll save, that has to do with taking revenge, which are all, related, because they're all in Parshas Kedoshim. You want to end here, Shmuel, or another 5 minutes?
Let's end here. We had to save something for Monday.
There's a whole Hilchos Talmud Torah for Monday.
We gotta save something for Tuesday.
Okay, you win. Okay, we will finish Hilchos